Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلوات وأتم التسليمات على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمين وعلى آله وأصحابه الطيبين الطاهرين وعلى من تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Alhamdulillah, ثم alhamdulillah. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Maulana Hamoud for organizing this program and inviting me to speak on this topic. I guess one of the interesting things about this whole experience and phenomenon of social media is experienced right now with the technical difficulties. It's one of sort of the challenges of modern technology is that as much as we want to make it subservient to us, it oftentimes makes us very much limited and subservient to it. But alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, these even these small challenges don't go unrewarded. I'd like to kind of preface this discussion with a maybe a forward, which is that the topic, which is the social media dilemma, do's and don'ts. We're really going to talk about the phenomenon of social media and actually the internet and technology in general, and not just the do's and don'ts, but the underlying philosophies and principles with which we should approach the social media. But I think one of the interesting challenges with this topic, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward Maulana Hamoud for choosing this topic and for Rayyan Institute for addressing this issue, but because it's such a novel issue, it's a new and challenging concept and phenomenon. We don't really have a lot of material and explicit guidance in regards to the texts as to how to deal with these issues. And social media, of course, is just one of many avenues of modern technology. And modern technology itself, it's made up of many components and parts. And so really social media as a topic is part of a broader discussion of technology in the internet, connectivity, etc. So I just kind of want to, mention that this is a very challenging topic for me. One of the things also it's about social media, which is challenging, is that even though I will discuss both the harms and the benefits, being on social media, I recognize that, I may have in my own experience made some of the, or experienced some of those harms, because of which I am sort of speaking from experience as well, but also trying to primarily speak from the perspective of principles and the Sharia, or what Islam says about the issue. But alhamdulillah, because of personal experience, having been and being on social media, I'll try to enrich the discussion with also personal experiences as well. But because, of course, this is a very new topic, and most of what I've seen in discussing the topic is primarily focused, I think, on what they call furu', or what I could say fairly is are ancillary discussions or details. Most of lectures online or articles online have dealt primarily with the details of social media. But what I'd like to sort of focus on today is more of an approach that looks at social media from a broader perspective, from the perspective of the philosophy of social interaction, social media, and the principles with which we should approach social media. Because if we go into the specifics, oftentimes we lose the big picture. So, in the traditional Islamic sciences, there tends to be at the beginning of any discussion, a framing of the discussion, creating of a framework by first and foremost, discussing terminology. So the important terminology here, of course, include the words social and the words media. Right? And this is the question that we should be asking ourselves when we deal with the topic, or any topic for that matter. How do we define the terms that are going to be discussed, and what are the parameters of our discussion? So the first thing to discuss is what does it mean when we say social? Okay, and so if you look at the word social as it's defined in, say, the dictionary, it'll give you these very specific definitions that social means anything related to or involving activities in which people spend time talking to each other or doing enjoyable things with each other. That's a very sort of ambiguous definition. Also, you find the definition of social as the tendency to form cooperative and interdependent relationships with others. And this is maybe more specific, the idea of cooperation, interdependency, right? Building relationships with others. But if you look at the Latin root, which comes from the idea of socialis or socius, meaning companion or ally or associate, we come upon this very important idea here that social relates to companionship, okay, relationships. And the idea of a social interaction is an interaction in which you're trying to develop companionship and with others, and then be affected by that companionship. So the idea here of social has to do with companionship, which in Arabic we call suhbah. So although we don't oftentimes look at social media or other social experiences necessarily as a part of suhbah in the Arabic, when we think of suhbah, we think of spirituality, we think of companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But in reality, there is very much this element of suhbah when it comes to social media, and that's the first point. And this is why the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, if you look at the various definitions of the Sahaba, one of the definitions that's given really emphasizes the idea that companions of the Prophet والسلام, were companions because they spent an amount of time in the company of the Prophet ﷺ that affected them in such a way that it changed the way that they interacted with others. It changed their personality. It changed their character. It changed their actions and their deeds. And so that was all because of what? Social interaction with the Prophet ﷺ, or their companionship with him. Now, the second important term here is media. And media is broadly defined as a medium of cultivation, conveyance, or expression, which is quite broad and inclusive. It includes many different forms of media that we experience today, including like television, the internet. It includes theater and the arts. These are all mediums of expression. And it comes from the Latin feminine of medius, which it comes from the idea the voice stops being regarded as intermediate between the tenuous and the aspiratus. So basically, essentially, if you look at this definition of media as being an expression, right? A vocal expression, could be a written expression. It's basically a means to express our interactions and to develop relationships with others through expression, and in particular today through online expressions, right, or online conveyances. To get an idea of what social media and how important it is in our lives today. Social media, meaning like communication through the internet, the virtual world, and establishing relationships. So again, I'm going to highlight this quite often throughout this seminar. The idea of establishing relationships through the internet. And the internet, of course, is in your pocket, it's on your laptops, it's all over the place. So this sort of a new phenomenon of easy communication between people, no matter where they are in the world, even in fact in space now, right? Through long distances, establishing companionship or relationships through these long distances. This has become so widespread that if you look at the statistics, it's quite mind-boggling because of the spread of it. So if you look at these statistics, and this was done by an organization called We Are Social, and you can find this information also online. The total population, which they estimate to be 7.2 billion, if you look at the total population of humans on the earth, and you look at them, the active internet users, that's 3 billion. That's nearly half of the human population. And of those who are engaged with the internet, you find that 2.078 billion people have active social media accounts. Active social media accounts meaning that you don't have, spam accounts or these, bot accounts, like fake accounts, but actually active social media accounts. They're not just idle. And then of them, unique mobile users, and mobile users, the statistic is important to recognize how accessible uh, the internet is and social media is through modern smartphones. You find that in today's day and age, you have about 3.649 billion people um, who are unique mobile users. And then in terms of active mobile social accounts, you have 1.685 billion. And these are huge numbers. If you imagine 100 years ago, how much connectivity there was compared to today, it's quite mind-boggling, right? Just the amount of information that we're exposed to today, it's really a huge shift from where we were even just 100 years ago. I believe I read a statistic somewhere that 100 years ago, it may have been 80 to 100 years ago, if you looked at the amount of information that a person uh, had access to or was exposed to in their entire lifetime, just the amount of information that a person would have been exposed to in their entire lifetime a year ago, I'm sorry, 100 years ago or 80 years ago, compared to today. So they said that if you take 1 week's worth of the New York Times and look at the amount of information that's found within, 1 week's worth of the information found within the New York Times is equivalent to what a person would have been exposed to in terms of information 80 to 90 years, 100 years ago in their entire lifetime. So the amount of information that we're exposed to is phenomenally larger. In addition, the scope and the reach of that information is now through the internet reaching 3 billion people. And if you look at the condition of many people out there in the world today, it's actually really astonishing to see that people who don't have necessarily even electricity in their homes, I'm not exaggerating, people who don't have electricity in their homes, they will still have mobile phones or cell phones, and they're charging them at work or in public spaces. But even people who are, really otherwise, um, not, wealthy, impoverished, they are connected to the rest of the world through mobile technology or through the internet. And of course, this has really affected modern life, right? As a result of which there are positive effects and negative effects. If you look at the amount of individuals or the percentage of individuals of a certain age group who have access to the internet, and then on top of that, social media, it's in one study they found that about 70% of 12 to 17-year-olds, and 12 to 17-year-olds are experiencing the formative period of their life, right? This is the age in which people are experiencing puberty, and they're experiencing physical growth and development, but also intellectual maturity. This is a very important period of a person's life. 70% of 12 to 17-year-olds are using social media on a regular basis. That's a really incredible statistic. Of course, this is probably a survey that was done in the Western world, but I think that it's still relevant if you look at, of course, most of the people who are probably listening to this webinar are from that group. So about 70% of people from similar backgrounds as our own, from the age of 12 to 17, are engaged in social media. 53% of surveyed social media users in one particular survey had said that their engagement with social media had changed their behavior. This is really actually a fascinating statistic, and I'll talk a little more about this later, inshallah. But what's even probably scarier is that one statistic states that according to their, and remember, these are quite limited in terms of their sample sizes. So these surveys have to be taken with a grain of salt. But according to one survey, 90% of 8 to 16-year-olds, 90% of 8 to 16-year-olds have viewed pornography online. Now, depending on how you define pornography, right? Because I think the Islamic perspective of what is pornographic is even broader than what Western standards consider pornography. You might even have to increase that. I asked one scholar, we were having a discussion on an issue similar to this, and he said that, who hasn't seen, what would Islamically be considered pornography? And I asked him, well, there are people who are saving themselves from that, and he said, well, how can you? They're on billboards, and I was like, what do you mean by that? How could you say that um, pornographic images are on billboards? And he was like, well, according to our definition of what is the awra, you know, shouldn't we consider that pornographic? And I said, well, you have a point. There are a lot of things that we are exposed to, we become desensitized to, that are not technically considered even pornography. And if the statistic is correct, for an 8-year-old, all the way up to the 16-year-old age group, if people are in that age group being exposed to images which are very hard to remove from the mind, this is one of the very clear negative effects of the proliferation of the internet and also social media, which is a part of that. So, the point being here that the internet and social media is, whether we like it or not, it's a reality of our age, right? Nearly 70% of 12 to 17-year-olds, if they're using the internet and social media in particular, that means that even a higher percentage are using the internet, and it's almost become like a necessity. And a lot of people, they discuss the idea of removing themselves from social media, removing themselves from the internet, etc. They mentioned that, well, our kids at school sort of have to have access to the internet. They have to do their assignments over the internet. Some people are even saying that some schools sort of almost require social media engagement for projects, etc. So this is just a reality of our time, and whether we like it or not, people are engaged with the internet, even despite all of the harms involved. You see that scholars have come to the conclusion that this is something that's sort of here to stay. We need to sort of understand how to regulate it. Now, the important discussion, of course, here is how do we approach the internet, and in more specifically social media, from the perspective of principles. And I would really like to emphasize here that as students of knowledge and as Muslims in general, we are people of principles. Okay? We should not get lost in the specific details. What is the ruling of this issue or that issue, without looking first and foremost at the underlying principles and the philosophy behind things. And I've seen that most of the discussions regarding social media and the internet tend to skip over these discussions. Not all of them, but many of them. And so people are, discussing the issue of the permissibility of using certain avatars, or the permissibility of certain types and avenues of social media, like Snapchat, as opposed to, Instagram. But when we get lost in those discussions without first asking the bigger picture issues or bigger picture questions, like what is the purpose of the internet, then I think that it becomes very challenging for us to look at social media through the lens of Quran and Sunnah. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the purpose of the internet? Okay. Why do we use it? What is the purpose of its creation? And I would like to invite people to study the works that have been written on the internet and technology in general, and try to understand who the people that are creating the new tools and technologies, under what philosophy are they working? Okay, are they designing software and operating systems and social media platforms as a tool for you to better the quality of life? Is it a tool for research? Is it a tool for instruction, or say just communication and correspondence? Or is it more a means of, advertising? Is it a form of entertainment? Is it meant to occupy your time in a healthy manner, right? All of the technologies that we are exposed to today, what is the purpose of their development? And if you look at actually just the example of Facebook, I think it will be very telling. The people who designed Facebook, they designed it to create relationships of of um, a marital nature, or I shouldn't even restrict it to the marital nature, but between men and women, for example, or they created these tools to maximize the amount of time that you're spending on them, or they're using them as a replacement of other forms of entertainment, or as a competition for other forms of entertainment, etc. So, what should the Muslim's approach be when he looks at social media or the internet? This is a really important question. I think that to summarize, the developers of new technology are developing this technology to be more than just a tool that serves you, right? It's meant to be social media, the internet. These are meant to be much more than just tools. They're meant to sort of guide your life. They're meant to occupy your time. They're meant to distract you from other things. And they're meant to entertain you. They're meant to sell you products. They're meant to make money from you. And living in a capitalist society, that shouldn't surprise us. This is not some massive conspiracy. It's just the reality. But should that be our approach? Should our approach to social media be the same as those who are developing those technologies? And this is a really important question. I really believe that when we look at the ultimate purpose of the internet, we should simply look at the internet as one of several things. Number one, we should look at the internet. So this is inclusive of social media, but also just your computers and the internet in general. We should look at the internet as a resource for either research and learning, or for perhaps work, buying and selling, right? Trade, etc. Or it should be a means of correspondence and communication, which is one of the great advantages of the internet, is that it allows us to facilitate and speed up communication between people around the world. And we should maybe perhaps also include in that, in the purpose of the internet, and also under communication, that we can use the internet and social media as a means of instruction, as a means of learning and education. Okay, of course, the limits of how much we should be using these tools for those purposes, like how much should we be using the internet for research, is a separate question. How much should we be using the internet for learning? That's a different question. Even correspondence, like how much should we be really using email? How much should we be using even text messaging? It's a great tool, but how much is too much? That's another question. But if we think of the purpose of the internet as being a tool for, again, research, communication, education, and perhaps also business, then I think that one can control and their usage and use the internet in a healthy manner. The second issue I want to discuss here is the principle of darura, or the principle of necessity. And I think that many people, they delve into the internet or social media as well, without asking themselves this question. And if you look at the hesitation that many of the traditional scholars exhibited when they were engaging with new technologies, part of it was this question that we sort of already have healthy social interaction in the form of face-to-face interaction. We have healthy societies that don't require like microphones and televisions and radios. So when these new technologies would be introduced to post-industrial Muslim societies, the question that people would ask is, do we really need this? Right? Is it improving the quality of life? Is it improving our worship? Is it improving our development as a community, our development as individuals? And so one of the questions we need to ask ourselves regarding social media is, okay, is this a need? Right? Is it really a need for us? If it's a need, what is the degree of need? So in Islam, for example, there is a principle that things that are otherwise perhaps reprehensible become permissible to the degree that they are needed. So if something like if a person was in the desert, or it was, let's say, was in the wilderness and had no access to any food except for, let's say, pork, right? So they found like a pig. That was the only food that they had accessible to them. The principle of the permissibility of now consuming it, because it's a life or death situation, is that one may only consume as much of that pork or pig as is now needed to survive. Anything more than that is now questionable. Okay, or I should say, if it's clearly not needed, then it becomes again impermissible. So now, if a person was in a situation where they found themselves in a life or death situation and they could eat pork, that doesn't mean now that like when they come back home and are in complete ease and facility and they can eat whatever they want, that they can still eat pork, right? Because the degree of need is no longer there, or the need is no longer there, I should say. So when it comes to social media, one of the questions that we should be asking is, okay, do we need this in our life? Is it going to improve our education? Is it going to improve our research? Is it improving our communication with our relatives? And if it is, then if we engage with it, how much becomes too much? And I just give it as an example, like sometimes too much information, like I mentioned, how much information are we exposed to on a daily basis or a weekly basis is almost incredible in this day and age. Sometimes too much information is not good for you. Sometimes too much learning is not good for you. Too much research is not good for you. If it's, for example, it's affecting one's ibadah, as an example. How much communication with relatives is too much? You know, there's a healthy distance between relatives that's also desirable in Islam. So that's the second principle. The third principle is the principle of controlled socialization. These are not like terms that are popular or conventional terms. These are terms I just sort of made up to express concepts that may not be in the English language. The principle of controlled socialization is the principle of uzla and khulta. There's a chapter in the Imam Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, the bab of uzla. It's a fascinating chapter on the discussion of the virtue of social isolation and the virtue also of social interaction, and which is preferable to the other. And Imam Ghazali discusses the various opinions about khulta, or mixing with people, and how positive that can be and also how negative it can be. And I would love to have maybe a separate seminar or discussion on that particular topic as well, because it's very relevant to our day and age. And I kind of look at this as the question in the modern age of just being plugged in, right? Because isolation is very helpful. And Imam Ghazali, and just to discuss this very briefly, inshallah, but Imam Ghazali, rahmatullah alayhi, he says that, and many of the early scholars were of the opinion that it is better to choose social isolation altogether. And he gives a number of names of the early scholars, including Sufyan al-Thawri and Ibrahim ibn Adham and Dawud al-Ta'i and al-Fudayl ibn Iyad and Bishr al-Hafi and others. But then he also says that there were many of the scholars who were of the opinion, the early Salaf, who were of the opinion that it is generally preferable to engage with the society and to interact with society and people. And amongst those scholars were like Sayyid ibn Musayyab, Shurayh, Qadi Shurayh, Imam Sha'bi, Ibn Mubarak, rahimahumullah jami'an, and others. And he says that each one of them had their evidence to prove their opinions. And so he says, for example, one of the evidences that supports the idea of the preference of social isolation is the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which he stated to Abu Sa'id Khudri, excuse me, when it was once said to him that, Ya Rasulullah, ayyun nasi khair, O Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who of the people is the best? So he sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, قال رجل يجاهد بنفسه وماله, that number one, a person who struggles with his self and with his wealth, ورجل في شعب من الشعاب يعبد ربه ويدع الناس من شره. And the second type of the best of people is the person who is like a man who lives or who resides in the mountain pass amongst the mountain passes, and he engages in the worship of his Rabb, وَيَدَعُ النَّاسَ مِنْ شَرِّهِ, and he avoids people. He like isolates himself from people to avoid their shar, their evil. And so he says that this is a proof that in many circumstances it's actually better to leave people, to kind of isolate yourself from others, to not interact, to not be social per se. And then he gives another interesting statement as a proof, which is the hadith of Umar ibn Khattab. So this is like the statement of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. And that is that he said that once, radiallahu anhu, خُذُوا بِحَظِّكُم مِّنَ الْعُزْلَةِ. Umar ibn Khattab said that خُذُوا بِحَظِّكُم مِّنَ الْعُزْلَةِ, that a portion for yourself, an amount of isolation. Meaning that a person should have as a part of their life a time, right, and perhaps a place where they can isolate themselves, where they're like unplugged, detached. And we're not talking about detachment in the modern sense, where you could be like in a room but be attached through social media. You could be alone, no physically around you, but you're still actually interacting through social media. That's actually one of the great challenges I feel today is that it's very hard to isolate yourself. It's very hard to unplug yourself in the true sense, meaning that you're unplugging yourself from people, but also from technology. And then it's interesting that Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, radiallahu anhu, when we're talking the best of the people, he once said that لوددت أن بيني وبين الناس باب من حديد لا يكلمني أحد ولا أكلمه حتى ألقى الله سبحانه وتعالى. He said that I wish that there would be between me and between people a door of iron that would prevent people from me speaking to them and them speaking to me until I meet my Lord, until I meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the exalted. So you see that the Sahaba radiallahu anhum did indeed, as Imam Ghazali says, contextually speaking, at times, not always, but at times and in specific circumstances, they did prefer social isolation in many cases. Why? Because excessive social interaction, right, uncontrolled socialization can be very spiritually harmful. And I want to finish this one principle with the statement of Abu Darda radiallahu anhu. I find this really fascinating. He said, radiallahu anhu, نعم صومعة المرء المسلم بيته يكف لسانه وفرجه وبصره وإياكم ومجالس الأسواق فإنها تلهي وتلغي. Abu Darda radiallahu anhu said, how excellent is the sawma'ah of a man, a Muslim man. What is a sawma'ah? Sawma'ah is like the monk's cell, right? It's a place of isolation where a person engages only in the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says, how excellent of a sawma'ah, like a monk's kind of a cell, is the house of the believer. Baytuhu, baytuhu. How excellent is his house as a place of what? Isolation for the purpose of worship. Why? He says, yakufu lisanahu, it controls his tongue, wa farjahu, and his private part, wa basarahu, and his sight. So how did essentially Abu Darda define the home? And why did he expose or speak about the virtues of the home? Because it was a place that you could detach yourself from haram things to look at, haram things to speak about, and haram uses of the private parts. And if you look at now the modern day with social media in our pockets and the internet in our pockets, you don't even have that at home. In fact, some people are engaging and interacting with others more at home than they would out in the public. And if they go outdoors, like, if they go on a walk or a stroll, they're probably more unplugged, so to speak, than if they were in their home. So you look at how the home has changed in the modern day. And how, because we don't control socialization now, the home is no longer sweet home. It's a place of more interaction and more distraction. And I think we're all guilty of this, myself first and foremost. That we're sitting with family, but we're interacting with people through text messaging, social media, we're checking the Facebook accounts, we're watching videos of random things that have no pertinence to necessarily our daily life. So we're actually now not at peace at home because we're constantly interacting. So uncontrolled socialization. And the last thing I'd like to speak about, inshallah, when it comes to principles, is the idea of the principle of exposure. The idea here that is that the internet, just like any other form of media, whether it be magazines or the newspaper or the television or radio, media, and amongst the forms of media, social media, it obviously exposes us to many different ideologies, many isms, I think ism was a new word in the dictionary this year. But isms is obviously a very common idea. There are many isms that are that are underneath the skin of social media. And when people speak on social media, whether it be Facebook or whether it be Twitter, whether it be Instagram, there are a lot of ideologies that we subconsciously pick up, and we expose ourselves to them constantly. Whether it be materialism, whether it be reductionist science, whether it be atheistic philosophy, whether it be agnosticism, whether it be any of the problematic ideologies of our time. In general, just modernism. How much of modernist ideology are we exposing ourselves on a daily basis on a daily basis because we are always connected to forms of media that were built by people who believe in those philosophies, right? People who, at the very core, do not believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. People at the very core who believe that religion is a problem for society, And so when we engage with any form of media, and in particular social media as well, we have to. How vigilant are we of those ideologies? And actually, if you look at it personally, I don't engage in any social media other than Twitter. I don't have a Facebook account, and a very limited use of other forms of social media, if any. And the reason is because I can control my exposure when it comes to like Twitter. And people actually mention this as a negative thing. I don't think it's a negative thing, because I think that one has to be very careful not to overexpose themselves to things that are not healthy. Now, being selective oftentimes is harmful when you are not grounded and you're not choosing what you're exposing yourself to properly. So like a right-wing extremist is only following right-wing extremist social media accounts. Obviously, for them not to sort of see or expose themselves to other perspectives is a problem. Right? People who hate Islam, who are not exposed to Islam, should expose themselves to it. But if you are exposing yourself constantly to people and institutions that expose or espouse and propagate problematic ideologies, how is that not going to affect you? And how is that not going to affect how you think subconsciously? And as I mentioned, that some of the principles that drive the development of new technologies, essentially those principles are the principles of what? Maximizing profit, using the internet as a means of advertising, the principle of entertainment, bread and circus societies that basically want to occupy our time, right? And so, I find it really fascinating if you look at a lot of the questions that we ask about the permissibility or impermissibility of things. We don't ask the question of like, wait, what is the purpose? Why were these things developed? Shaykh Amin, who's I don't know, a senior Shaykh, he said something really fascinating about the question of music and the Quran. And he said, one of the really interesting things that people don't question when it comes to the purpose of music, or the purpose of, because people are always talking about the permissibility and impermissibility of music. But he said, one of the fun, because he's an usuli person, so he talks about the philosophy of things. He said, well, the interesting thing about the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Quran is that, what does it tell us? Tafirru ila Allah. The Quran, the recitation of the Quran, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, our study of knowledge is what? An escape from this world, just like a lot of media, including television and the film industry and social media even, that is also a means of escape. The philosophy is still of an escape. You want to escape your problem, you want to escape your anxiety and stress. But Quran tells us what? That escape to Allah. And modern technology tells us escape to the dunya. So it's telling us what? Go to that which is fake instead of what is real. So in social media, this is one of the issues, that we're always like exposing ourselves to people's fake lives, fake ideals. And the Quran is saying, no, escape, but don't escape to a fantasy. Escape to a higher reality, which is the akhirah. So that philosophy is there, and I don't think we realize enough of that philosophy is really guiding the technology, and that we become very materialistic, and we become very worldly, and we become very modernistic in a negative sense because of our constant exposure. So we have to control that exposure. Now, I want to now, conclude, inshallah ta'ala, or now speak for the rest of the seminar on these issues of what are the four dimensions of self-development, and how does social media affect it, both positively and negatively. So if you look at the self as not just a physical body, but a composition of four parts, or four elements, the body, the human is composed of course, his jism. So there's a physical element, but there's also the intellectual or aqlani element or aqli element of the human, and then there's a psychological or nafsani element, and then there's also the spiritual or the ruhani. And so when we talk about social media and how it's affecting us, I think we should talk about it from all four angles. How is it positively and how is it negatively affecting us? Now, the positive effects, I think, are pretty clear. Physically, the positive effect is that some people, and these are sort of a stretch sometimes, but people are actually, they benefit from social media, they benefit from the internet in physical development. They learn, how to exercise in certain ways. They learn to improve their health and, how to improve their cooking, etc. Through the internet and through social media. And so that's a positive. Psychologically, I think a lot of people who suffer from an extreme lack of social interaction, they can benefit from the anonymity of the internet and social media by interacting with people, even if they cannot interact physically. Intellectually, there's definitely a benefit of social media in that, and we see that many scholars are actually very much engaged with certain forms of social media because it gives them an opportunity to intellectually communicate with one another and to improve in their learning and improve in their research and understand what new books have been published in different fields and who's engaged in what in the field of academics. And so there's a lot of intellectual development also and advantages of social media. And then spiritually, it's really fascinating that, yeah, even though there are so many spiritual harms to social media also has been, although it is limited, I think, a means of spiritual development for many people who are not able to connect to spiritual guides or to spiritual people except through long distance communication, which is accomplished oftentimes through social media. So there's a work benefit also. I think work, people, obviously are able to raise enough money for their families through the internet and through social media. Many people, that's their job. Research, there's an advantage of social media when it comes to research. I personally benefit a lot from the internet. In fact, I'm engaged. I actually recently downloaded, a new not really social media, Telegram, like a WhatsApp sort of chat application, so that I could engage with other scholars and students of knowledge and do research. And it's really helped me with my research. And so that is that advantage. Education, I think Rayyan Institute is a proof of that there's a huge benefit of social media through education. Many of you may have, become aware of classes or webinars through, Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts, etc. Correspondence, there's advantage of being able to communicate with relatives and teachers, students through the internet, and that's a huge positive. And then also networking, right? Just in general, people are able to accomplish quite a bit in life because they're able to network with the right people through social media, right? So job opportunities come up, marriages are facilitated oftentimes through social media. So these are clear advantages, right? There are also, of course, a huge number of negative aspects. And I've sort of given a lot of attention to this so that we're able to balance, because I think a lot of people, if they're already engaged with social media, they know what the benefits are. That's why they're on. So I want to kind of counterbalance that with a thorough discussion of the negative effects. So one of the physical negative effects of social media is laziness, right? And this has been proven. There's a lot of information that I was able to collect and research. I don't have the luxury of the time to be able to discuss all of them. So I'm just going to kind of jump through these bullet points. The first thing is that we've seen that with the proliferation of social media, that people have become physically actually negatively affected. More people are likely to become lazy and less physically active because of social media. Interestingly enough, joint ailments. There are people with now wrist issues and elbow issues. They suffer from the strangest of ailments because they're holding up their phone the wrong way, or they're using their phone too much. Their posture is being affected. And then, of course, reduction of exercise, because social media is designed to occupy a lot of our time. So then that time we're not usually using being active and exercising. And in our deen, physical health, and this is really unfortunately something that we don't emphasize enough, physical health is very much a part of our deen. It was very much a part of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. It was very much a part of the life of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, and many of the awliya and the great ulama. They were extremely active, and our life has become very sedentary. And even the amount of daily walking that we used to accomplish, just going to like the masjid or work, or that's also become greatly reduced because we're shopping online and we're doing everything online. The intellectual effects are also quite significant. One of the major effects is loss of focus, because we've become multitaskers in modern society. We've become so adept at multitasking. You know, how many of us have like multiple tabs open on their internet right now? Like how many even? It's almost unbelievable how much we're able to do at the same time. But negatively speaking, because the brain is not able to tackle too many tasks at the same time, we're doing many different tasks, but not many different tasks very properly. So we're losing focus, and this is becoming a very important, a pressing issue now, especially young people, that they just can't. They have this attention deficiency. I don't know if you call it disorder, but almost the level of a disorder, and that's because they just can't focus. They're just too used to doing so many things and occupying every second of their life with social media, with the internet, with doing one thing after the other, and so it's negatively affecting the intellectual development. Our memories are being affected. We're also becoming, unfortunately, because of the way that we expose ourselves to the internet, selective learners. We're not exposing ourselves to a lot of things that we should be out there in the open, like out there in the real world. We're just interacting so much online that we're not getting even a real sense of what's happening out there in the world. Many of us don't go to the library anymore. Many of us don't go to the town hall. We don't go to engage with the community in the neighborhood like we used to. Children don't go outside anymore, and so they're not learning a lot of the basic skills that are needed for intellectual development, like stuff like going outside and playing with the dirt. It's actually a very important learning experience. Next, psychologically, one of the negative effects is addiction. This is actually not just a problem within one particular community, but just across the internet. In fact, they found that in one study that 63% of Americans log on to Facebook daily, 63%, and amongst them 40% are multiple times checking their Facebook. And as a result, what they found is that it's created an addiction, and they actually have a scale to measure this addiction. It's called the Berg Facebook Addiction Scale, meaning that it's such a problem that they've actually developed scales to measure the level of people's addiction. And when they were asked, people who were surveyed were asked, like, why are you so constantly engaged with social media? Why this addiction? Many people said the same thing, that it had to do with distraction and boredom relief. Distraction and boredom relief. And others said that like likes and the approval that you get through the internet, and comments on your videos or comments on your retweets and comments on your posts, that people have become addicted to the positive reinforcement of that interaction, right? And it becomes very difficult then to stop. This is a problem. Like, if you don't feel like I've done something positive until people retweet or like your post, then this is possibly a sign of addiction. And it's very spiritually harmful. Other thing, psychologically, how it affects us is lifestyle comparison. What we expose ourselves to through the internet is an idealized version of other people's lives, which actually oftentimes we see that's not even true. People who are like homeless present themselves through social media as being, rich and happy and wealthy. People who are celebrities and seemingly very happy because of the way that they present themselves on social media or through television, etc., are actually very unhappy people. Many of them going through depression, commit suicide, etc. Many of them are, we see this all the time, committing suicide. But the result is what? That we compare ourselves to them constantly. Why does this person have this type of a car? Or I wish I had that, and I wish I had this. I wish I had, the popularity that so and so has on the internet. People would send me free stuff, and I wish I was as, well known. I wish I had celebrity status. And so, in a survey that was done in 2012 in the UK, 53% of people who were surveyed said that social media actually had changed their overall behavior in life. And of those 53%, 51% that it was said that it was negative behavior. And why? Because they said that it was a decline in confidence they felt because of unfair comparisons to others. So lifestyle comparison is very harmful, right? It negatively affects us psychologically and then actually also just general patterns of life. It also creates restlessness. Two-thirds of people who were um, two-thirds of people who were surveyed in one survey mentioned that they have a very difficult time relaxing because when they get detached from the social media accounts, they just can't relax, right? And that's a huge problem. And then unhappiness, right? There's just a general unhappiness that comes with social media. You would think that it would make you more happy, but unfortunately, the result is that most people, when they're asked, they find themselves to be overall less happy because of social media interaction. And then one interesting thing that one psychologist mentioned as a result of social media, that there's this thing called the fear of missing out, or the FOMO, that social media creates this phenomenon that you feel pressured into doing many other things because you're just so engaged with other people's lives. So even religious things like, oh my God, so and so went to this conference, or went to this bayan, I went to this, going to this class, and you feel, well, I'm living somewhere I can attend that, and you just feel like I'm missing out all the time, and this psychologically affects you, even with good things. So if you engage too much with social media, you always feel like I just there's something missing in my life, and that's a problem. And then lastly, the spiritual. One of the things Imam Ghazali talks about is that over interaction or too much khulta or social interaction, it desensitizes us to the unlawful. And I know I'm about the end of my time now, but I just want to mention one story. One example that he gives is a really fascinating example. Imam Ghazali says that if you look at how we judge the various degrees of permissibility and permissibility, it becomes very warped when we interact too much with people. And he gives us an example. And I think in America this is a big problem for us in the U.S. And I know we have an international audience here, but I think I cannot speak too much about every other country. But I know here in the U.S. this is a problem. That because we're so distanced from traditional scholars, and the way that they taught, and we're so overexposed to things that kind of warp our sense of what's right and what's wrong, we don't have a sense of like the severity of some impermissible things, and also the value of the seemingly small and mundane good things. And Imam Ghazali gives an example. He says that if you look at how when people interact with like the learned, so he gives an example of the learned. He said, imagine that if you saw a scholar who gave a khutbah wearing a silk thobe, right, or silk jubba, how much commotion would people raise? Or imagine if that person was wearing a gold ring, a man giving a khutbah and he's wearing a gold ring. He says, imagine the reaction that you would have to that. That people would not allow this person to give a khutbah again. He's like, oh my God, this person's committed haram and in public, right? But he says then, imagine also that you hear, let's say, a scholar or a learned person or a leader of the community backbite. And how many times do we hear people backbiting, but we become so desensitized to it because it's just so common that we don't think of it as a big deal, despite the reality of the matter, which is that backbiting is worse than wearing a gold ring for a man. A far greater sin. And yet we don't treat it that way. Why? Because desensitization to the unlawful. And this becomes greatly more pronounced when it comes to social media. And then, of course, there's jealousy that arises in the heart. A lot of engagement in the la ya'ni, right? Engagement in the vain and unnecessary. So much of what we do on the internet is just completely unnecessary. The waste of time. It's occupying our time in things that really are not going to benefit us in this world or in the hereafter, right? Cat videos and I don't know whatnot. I mean, there's so many things that, if there's a benefit, there's a benefit sometimes to some of the seemingly mundane things, but there's so much that we engage in that's unnecessary, right? And then, of course, it weakens the spiritual filter. It weakens our ability to see what is beneficial to us and what is and harmful to us. And that's a result of what overexposure to that, which is impermissible. And we see so much that's impermissible, even advertised. I mean, subhanAllah, when Twitter and I think some other social media platforms started advertising. It was a huge issue for me. Now for my family as well, more so for my family. She was like so upset. My wife was so upset that you're something that was otherwise controllable. Now they're pushing these images and these advertisements at you. So it's very hard then to not become desensitized to that, because overexposure weakens the spiritual filter, and that's a problem. Heedlessness, ghafla, this is something that very clearly is happening as a result of social media. And then constriction of the soul, which is a result of what? Enough dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and too much khulta, too much social interaction. Now, the 5 recommendations with which I'll sort of end this, inshallah ta'ala, this webinar, are 5 steps, as well as 5 recommendations. These are my 5 recommendations as to how, knowing, and as I mentioned in the beginning, that this is kind of a reality of our time. We can't get rid of the internet. We can't get rid of these media channels, but we can control them, and we have to control them. And one of the things I'm noticing is that there are ulama who are engaged, senior scholars who are engaged in social media, but they're very controlled. So that sort of gives us an idea that, obviously it's not impossible to use the internet, to use social media without great harm. But you have to be very, very careful. And so the first thing is that we should only engage in social media when the benefit is clear. So if you just kind of do muhasabah of yourself and all the accounts that you are part of, like how much of that is necessary, how much is clearly beneficial, we should do a kind of analysis, a cost analysis of each of our social media accounts, and then only engage in those social media platforms or in the amount of time that we give to it where the benefit is clear. Step 2, and this of course is a broad principle, avoid the unlawful wherever it is. Wherever the unlawful is, whatever means to the unlawful, we should avoid it. Meaning that you're going to obviously be exposed to the lawful and the unlawful. Avoid the unlawful where it is, on the internet and social media. Just because social media is a reality of our time doesn't mean that now it's permissible for us to expose ourselves to the unlawful. So whenever you see something haram on Facebook, block it. You should have ad filters on your browsers. You should be very careful about following people that are not careful about what they post, right? You should be very careful about yourself as a person putting up things that other people would see that they're not allowed to see. You might think, oh, I'm just kind of sharing my pictures with my friends who are female. Well, how do you know that their husband or their brother or something's not accessing their accounts and seeing you in a way that they're not allowed to see you? So avoid the unlawful in both ways, in what you're exposed to and in what you're exposing others to. If you're a male, the same thing applies, right? Don't think of your audience as limited as your followers. There's a lot of things that you shouldn't be posting up online. A lot of things that you shouldn't be proud of and you're putting up online. Avoid those things. Number 3, set limits. Okay? If we understand social media is a necessity, then you should set time limits. You should set limits of space, and there should be places where you just don't use social media. In interacting with people in the middle of a conversation, you shouldn't be checking a Twitter account. That's beyond the limit. If you're sitting in a classroom, you shouldn't be checking Twitter, right? Unless, of course, like someone told you to during the Raya Institute's webinar to tweet stuff. If that's your responsibility, then fine. But there are settings where it's not appropriate. Recognize those limits. Recognize time limits. And so if it's a necessity, then you shouldn't be engaged with it all the time. Step 4, monitor yourself and others. The best way to control yourself is not to try to control it yourself, but allows others to monitor you as well. So having software that on your computer that basically allows others to monitor your activity on the internet is very beneficial. Then your email accounts and your social media accounts should not be private. As a rule, for example, even if my family doesn't always check, but my social media, my email is all public. Meaning in the sense that my wife and my family, are able to access them, and I want them to, so that there is a clear understanding that there's nothing that is untrustworthy going on. So monitor yourself and monitor others. Allow others to monitor you as well. This is very healthy because it has to be a very controlled environment. One of the things that my Shaykh told me about the internet when I was coming back to Pakistan, this was in 2006, was that make sure that you use the internet in a place that's not private, because there was so many there's so many distractions and temptations in private. So social media also should not be private. How many marriages have broken up because of improper communication through Facebook, private messages, etc. So don't allow yourself to do that by making everything accessible to those people who are making monitors for you. And then lastly, balance your life, balance your interaction with isolation, disconnect, unplug, prioritize the real over the virtual. You should prioritize real interactions, sitting with people face to face and interacting with them over the virtual interactions of our lives. The reality of the modern day, and I'm guilty of it just as much as anybody else, is that we just interact way more through virtual means than we do in person. And we find it very hard to disconnect because of that. Very hard to put your phone away. 70% of people who have smartphones, this is a fascinating statistic, 70 to 75% of people with smartphones have, in one survey, have admitted that they keep their smartphone with them within 5 to 6 feet of their body 24 hours a day. They sleep with it next to them. They eat with it next to them. They have it in their pocket at work. They have it in their pocket at school, meaning that we just are not able to even separate ourselves physically from our phones. And that's a problem, right? And if we recognize that that's a problem, no matter who we are, then we need to disconnect. And there have been at least 2 occasions on the internet myself, a personal experience I'm telling you because this is a challenge that I've experienced as well, that I've had to disconnect for some months because I just felt like, well, I'm checking too much. And there's actually an app you can find on your phones that will actually monitor how many times you open your phone, how many times you unlock your phone, And actually, I found myself oftentimes just checking the time on the phone, so I started wearing a watch more, just so I don't have to pull my phone out so much. And so when you see, if you're monitoring yourself, you're realizing, wow, I'm connecting way too much. I'm on Twitter way too much a day. I'm checking it too many times, or I'm checking my text messages way too much. People are observing that I'm not focused and I'm not paying attention to what they're saying. Then, take the important step to keep yourself grounded in reality and prioritize that. Disconnect yourself until you can feel that I'm back in control, I'm not addicted, and then step back in if it's needed. Otherwise, it's better just to disconnect altogether. With that, I just kind of wanted to supplement that with this last slide, or second to last slide, which is kind of just a discussion or a presentation of some data about how much we expose ourselves on the internet. One Shaykh I read had recommended that the most we spend 2 hours on the internet or on social media. I was astonished because I thought 2 hours is a lot, but I think maybe that's based upon the reality on the ground that people are not going to disengage. If you look at the average daily use of social media, it's already 2 hours and 13 minutes, in addition to television time and internet time. I think if a person wants to monitor themselves, if you're spending more than 1 hour on social media a day, I think that's actually not healthy. So we need to drastically reduce the amount that we spend online and on social media in order to bring back balance into our lives. And I think that a lot of that has to do with just setting limits. So if we try to monitor how much time we're on the internet and how much time we're on social media, I would say the maximum a person should be spending on social media, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or any of the other platforms. I really think 1 hour is the maximum that a person should be spending. And that much time you're spending in the dhikr of Allah. Maulana Bilal Sindhi in the 1940s, he said to his Maulana Bilal Anwar, who was his, I believe, I guess he was his step grandson. So Maulana Bilal Sindhi said to him that, oh, young people, right? And he was giving a lot of advice. He said, be accustomed to spending 1 hour a day in the dhikr of Allah. If we're spending 1 hour a day on social media, then at least we should be spending 15, 20, 30 minutes a day in the dhikr of Allah, right? Ideally, if you really want to be spiritually connected and balanced, you should be spending 1 hour a day. But because, that's so challenging, I'm not going to set that the standard that high. But this is what the Mashaykh used to say. If you want to be a successful person, a Muslim in this world, then get accustomed to spending 1 hour in the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So 1 hour on social media needs to be balanced. Imam Diyas rahmatullah alayh, he used to go for 3 days in da'wah, and then he would feel like I need to spend 3 days in the khanqa to balance all of that interaction, social interaction. So it's about balance, right? When, as much as you're engaged with society, we need to kind of counterbalance that with disengagement from society and engagement with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then I kind of wanted to, I think this is the second last slide, mention one quote of Imam Shafi, which is this. He says that constriction or inqibad with people results in the acquisition of their enmity, and expansion of interaction with people results in the, or inbisat with people results in the attraction of their evil. Be therefore between constriction and expansion. Imam Shafi kind of summarizes what I wanted to say in a really nice way, that there are two extremes here. You can completely constrict yourself, isolate yourself, and what happens is that people think, oh, this guy is so arrogant, look at him, he thinks he's better than everyone, and so you become their enemy. Because you don't, and then you don't interact with people, you don't show them you're good, and so complete constriction we're seeing in society, right? If your Muslim neighbor or your non-Muslim neighbor doesn't know you, you become like almost an enemy. But expansion, too much expansion also results in the attraction of their evil, overexposure to people's evil, and that's also negative. So therefore he says, be between the two, inbisat and inqibal. Be between constriction and expansion. Lastly, this hadith, I think, best summarizes the final kind of takeaway point. And this is a hadith in which Uqba ibn Amir radiallahu anhu asked the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Ya Rasulullah, man najat? What is salvation? So he sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he replied, he said, amsik lisanak. He said that control your tongue. He said, amlik alayka lisanak. Amlik alayka lisanak. Control your tongue. Wal yasak baytuk. And let your home be wasi' for you, sufficient and spacious enough for you. And he says, wabki ala khati'atik. And weep upon your mistakes. Meaning what? SubhanAllah, ajib. 3 important things when it comes to social media. Control your tongue. Control what you say. Control what you post. Control what you're doing. And then number 2, let your home suffice you. And by home, remember what Abu Darda radiallahu anhu said, that it's like the sawma'a, it's like the place of isolation and peace and tranquility and detachment, right? It's a place to avoid haram. So let your home be sufficient for you. If you constantly feel I need to be on social media, I need to be social, because I'm not finding satisfaction in the peace of my home and the isolation of my home, then that's not balance. And then, of course, weep upon your mistakes. Why? Because we're going to make mistakes. We're going to make mistakes in our interaction. We're going to say things we didn't want to say. We're going to post things we didn't want to post. We're going to see things we didn't want to see. We're going to lose control certain times. So we are going to make mistakes. So Rasulullah suggests, he recommends that always weep upon your mistakes, because that's a sign of true nadama, true repentance, and true regret. And if you weep upon your mistakes when it comes to social media, I hope and I pray for myself first and foremost, and for everyone, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will overlook our mistakes and make it a means of inshallah good, and make us the masters of it, right? Like the people of the past, they were masters of the pen and paper. When they wrote letters, they weren't worried that the letter, the paper, and the ink and the pen was going to control them. They were the masters of their means of communication. They were the masters of their media. They were the masters of their social interaction. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that because of the sincerity of our hearts and because we weep upon our mistakes, Allah allows us to become people who control our tongues and people who find tranquility and peace in the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the ibadah of Allah alone. With that, I will close and end. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive me my sins, to make me the first to be able to practice upon these nasihas, to be really honest. These are all nasihas that we all have to put into practice, but first and foremost, I need to put them into practice. And I won't claim that I am reaching any ideal, and I don't know if I have any balance in my usage of the social media, and I pray that I do reach that. But I ask first and foremost for myself and for everyone that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us that control and that balance, and allow us to benefit from the good of social media and to avoid its harm. وما علينا إلا البلاغ سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. think I'll pass it over then now to Hamoud.
Okay, Jazakumullah khair. Thank you, Bilal, for the fascinating insight. This discussion was really an eye-opener. Definitely one that can make a lot of us rethink our social media use. And something I think a lot of us definitely can relate to, a lot of these things that were discussed. So thank you for the insight. It was really appreciated. And as I said earlier, it was a great honor, and it is an honor for Rayyan Institute to have you come in and talk to us. So with that, I just want to take a few moments to do a little bit of advertising. Anything that's free, usually it comes with ads. So just want to encourage everybody to check out very briefly, when you get a chance, to go to Rayyan Institute's website, check out our offerings, our online courses on a range of topics that we offer. They're definitely, I feel, a good use of one's time on the internet as opposed to doing other things, especially for those who don't have access to reliable, Islamic scholarship. So it's something that a lot of people who don't have access can definitely benefit from. So I would encourage you to go to our website, look at our curriculum, see if it interests you, and perhaps share it with your family and friends, and those who may be able to benefit from what we have to offer. So with that, inshallah, I would like to invite the attendees to post any questions to Shaykh Bilal in regards to the discussion that we had today in regards to social media. So if you are going to post a question, a few ground rules. Just make sure that you have your name and location with the question so we know who it is and who to address. And also, if you can just keep it on this topic. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them out in the chat window. So, Shaykh Bilal, do you want me to read the questions to you, or are you able to manage those on your own?
I can manage them, inshallah.
Okay, okay, inshallah. I'll let you take it. You can just maximize the window. It makes it easier to read.
Okay, barakallah feek.
I apologize. The chat window, I guess. The icon which has a chat bubble. If you click on that, it'll open up the. So please feel free to post your questions. Inshallah, we'll take them now. Okay, so it seems like we're not getting any questions. Inshallah, that's fine. So we'll, if you have any feedback, if you want to reach out to Shaykh Bilal, the speaker today, and you have any other questions, you can always get in touch with us, and we'll forward your queries to him. And if you have any other feedback, feel free to get back to us, inshallah. Okay, so I guess that's it. Inshallah, we hope to have
some question.
Sorry.
I'm not sure if this is a question. It says posting pictures on social media. I'm assuming that there's a question there about the permissibility of posting pictures on social media. Okay. Mona, should I take the question then?
Please, go ahead.
So when it comes to posting pictures, I have obviously there's a legal element to it, a fiqh element to it, and to be very straightforward, I'm not an expert in Islamic law. I can only speak about the basics. And Mufti can tell you more about the issues of posting pictures in general. And of course, I know the ulama have differing opinions about permissibility of posting images in general, the nature of images. But from the perspective of just like islah, right? So there's an academic element to a discussion, and there's also sort of the element of, I think, this islah was the spiritually appropriate thing to do, or ethically appropriate thing to do. I think if you are especially a niqabi, as the question I believe is specific also to person who is wearing a niqab, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to be posting a picture of your face online. And the reason is because, as I mentioned before, the nature of the preservation of images on the internet as well as through social media accounts, and the fact it doesn't get deleted, and then the person who you think you're sending it to is not necessarily the only person that's going to have access to it, right? Anybody who has access to their social media accounts their photo app could potentially see your. So I think that if a person is following adhering to the rules of the hijab, then posting pictures of yourself is not wise at all. I also believe the same thing actually for men, and I don't like to. I mean, I'm personally of the opinion, and I follow those who believe in the general permissibility of digital photography or pictures, and in its limited use. But like personally, I don't put pictures of my family up online. Um, I really don't like even putting pictures of myself online unless it's absolutely necessary. And I think there's one of the reasons is what I mentioned before, that it leads to comparisons, it leads to jealousies. I think about it also. Someone once mentioned to me that like if you put like a picture of your children online, right? Like 20 years from now, 30 years from now, would they like that? That you put up pictures of them in different circumstances and situations. Like, would they really appreciate that? And, that's your private life. It should be not necessarily be compared and put out there in the open. If you look at the lives of celebrities, and everybody's trying to become a celebrity, if you look at the life of celebrities, they're trying to avoid because they become so like bothered by exposure that they don't want people taking pictures of them anymore. But then they do. It's sort of a really weird schizophrenic, attitude towards it. I don't believe in general that it's very wise to put personal pictures online. When it comes to pictures of other things like just random things, other things. Also, I think people should be controlled. I don't really think it's healthy to be taking pictures of what you're eating and where you're going online as well. Like you're always going to these nice places and then you're like posting it. It creates jealousy. You're eating nice food. You go to a nice restaurant. You think, well, I'm just going to share it with people who think well of me. It's not always the case. There are people who will become negatively affected by because they're comparing themselves or they're feeling missing out. They look at your happy life and they might look at it in a negative way. It could be even your best friend. It could be people that your family members, who's like, why did so and so get to go on vacation to this place? And look what they're eating and look what they have. So we really have to be very controlled and careful about that. We don't want we don't want to open the doors of spiritual disease for others. I hope that answered that question. And the issue of gender interaction on social media, I was waiting for that question. I think the limits of gender interaction are obviously the same as face to face, except that it's a lot more. It's a lot easier to not recognize what is beyond limits when it comes to social media interaction. I personally don't communicate with people privately of the opposite gender, whether it be through social media or through email, except that my family knows of it. If somebody asks me even a very serious question, I'm very particular that my wife needs to know about it. And that's, I think, really important. People don't do that. And I think that if you are the purpose of using social media is to use it as an instrument, to use it as a tool, then you shouldn't really be needing to interact too much with the opposite gender. For what purpose, right? What purpose? So if it's for just social interaction, then I don't think it's a good idea. And if it's like research, right, or maybe even dawah, then it has to be very, very controlled. Right? It has to be very controlled. So there are times where you will interact with others online, and it will be positive, but it has to be very controlled. So again, I think if you look at the underlying philosophy of social media from the perspective of a Muslim, it should be very much restricted to that which is beneficial and that which is necessary. And I oftentimes feel that the reason that we interact with people online is because we are trying to fill a vacuum in our face-to-face interaction. Okay, so if a person is constantly communicating with people online because they are not finding that interaction face to face, then that's not healthy. Okay. There was a question here about posting pictures of people who have passed away. I don't think it's a good idea to post pictures of people who've passed away, especially people who've passed away and then their body has not been preserved. This is an amana. This is there are a lot of mistakes people are making, and I think people are looking at the benefits of like showing people the atrocities that are going on in the world, or look, this pious scholar passed away. This is how he looked in his final stages. I really don't like that. I know that if I was sick and I was on my deathbed, I wouldn't want people to take pictures of me in a compromised state and put it up online, even if they were people who were doing it out of love. I think that's an adab issue more than anything else. I think a lot of people take pictures of scholars out of the love for them, but they take pictures of them in a very compromising way. If it's not a very appealing pose that they're in, or maybe they're doing something that they consider to be a private act. Like I think there's like videos of this is a great Syrian Shaykh, and there was a video of him in a swimming pool. He's actually very old and doing something that's very beneficial to swim and exercise. But someone took a picture of it. It didn't seem like it was appropriate. So yeah, I think it's a matter of just respect. Even if the scholar doesn't have an issue with photography, there's the issue of making them maintaining their honor and their dignity. Okay. Let's see. If one was trying to seek guidance from a person from the opposite gender. So to repeat that point, it must be done in such a way that if you were in person going to that person, would you be speaking to them in private, right? So if you are going to, like, let's say a sheikh, you would only, let's say a female was to go to a male sheikh, or the opposite, would you do it in private? No, you wouldn't, right? You may interact with them, miwara hijab or properly covered, but you would do it in a public manner. So the same thing applies if you are emailing a teacher or a guide, or you are interacting with them through social media, which I don't think is a very good way of interacting with them usually. Social media is not the best platform for that. But if that's the only way that you can contact them, then it must be, again, according to the rules of privacy. It cannot be khalwa. It cannot be khalwa. Okay, there are people seeking proposal for marriages online, posting pictures and seeing proposals online. Okay, so you're seeking proposals online. I think I'm just going to sort of defer that question for maybe some other time or for some other person, just because this issue is a really important issue, marriages and the nature of marriages, and the problem that people are having finding partners. And it has to also do with the change in society. Society has really changed, and in Western countries where the entire neighborhood is not Muslim or the entire nation is not Muslim, it's very challenging to find proposals. And I think that element has to be kept in mind. And then additionally, we must speak about the legal element of how a person can approach marrying in a halal manner. In terms of social media, like, social media is not really a good way of determining who a person is or whether they're going to be a good partner, right? Whether it's you directly who's interested, or you're interested for someone else, like a child or your own child or brother, etc. So I'd be very careful, because social media is very fake, right? Social media, if you look at your own accounts, I oftentimes do that. I look at my account. This is kind of the spiritual idea of muhasaba. If you go through your account and you observe it as an outsider, what impression do you get, right? And oftentimes I find that, like, this is not really who I am, right? Maybe this is a part of me. Maybe this is something I'm trying to become, but this is not necessarily who I am. And I think that's really important to recognize, especially when looking for partners for yourself and for others, that what you see on social media is not really a person. Even face-to-face interaction before marriage is very much an exhibition. It's not really the reality of that person. So you have to do your research when it comes to marriage, and social media is bad research. I hope that answered that question. This is a very good question. Mashallah, all the questions are good. But this is an interesting question. That I don't post pictures at all. When family members post their pictures, such as their newborn or their wedding photos, can I comment and like the photos even though I don't approve of them posting the photos to keep good relations with them? In terms of like the benefits of social media, I think this is one of the benefits of social media is keeping in contact with family, especially family that doesn't live in the same country or the same city, and kind of interacting with them in a healthy manner online by sharing, news as well as maybe even for those who consider it to be permissible, and maybe pictures of oneself. But then you also have to recognize the potential harms. I think in terms of posting photos of oneself, like birth, is sort of making an announcement or of a marriage, as long as you're within the confines of what is permissible. I think that's actually a positive usage of the social media. But again, maintaining privacy is very challenging, right? So if you have like a private Instagram account, for example, and you want to share with, let's say, your grandfather or grandmother or your parent abroad, the birth of your children and how they're growing up, and so you FaceTime with them from time to time or whatever technology you use for video chatting or sending pictures. I think that's for those who consider that the use of digital media to be permissible, I think that's a positive use. But again, there are many disadvantages, and some of the disadvantages is always posting the good of your life. It oftentimes creates jealousy. So if you have like an extended family who are interacting and posting pictures, and everybody's competing with one another to show how happy they are or how much they're, I don't know, doing khidmah of grandparents or whatever. There's a lot of potential for harm, just like there is in face-to-face interaction. So I don't think that there's necessarily it's wrong to approve of those posts, to comment on those posts, to interact just like you would if you were in person. But again, the same rules apply, and the principle of control here and controlled socialization is still very important. I guess I don't know if I said all I wanted to say on that issue, but I do think that one of the positives of social media is the ability to easily communicate with family. And I think that if you also post pictures or you view pictures and comment on pictures, as long as it's within the hudud, the proper limits, it's fine. But there's still, it has to be very, very tightly controlled, right? You don't want to show off. You don't want to overexpose yourself or your family to others, even family members. You don't want to expose them to the possibility of the evil eye of another, etc., right? So it should be done in a very controlled manner. Having a friend online on the social media without your partner's knowledge is zina in Islam. Having a friend online on social media without your partner's knowledge is zina in Islam. So there's real zina, and then there's metaphorical zina, right, or figurative zina. And figurative zina is equal to the physical zina potentially in the sin, but not in the reality. Or it can be not the same in level of sin, but leading up to it. If you have a relationship, a private relationship with someone of the opposite gender, or actually even now today we should say the same gender, but it's of a flirtatious nature, then yes, it is a form. It is one of the muqaddimat, those things that lead to zina. It is impermissible. So whether it's zina or not is a separate discussion. It's impermissible. Okay, so one should be very careful about that. A bit of a weird question, but would it be against parda to expose one's personality online? not pictures, but I guess just from one social media account, you get an idea usually. Again, what we expose to our people online is usually not our personality, but or a part of our personality. Usually, it's only we try to show the positive part of our personality, and sometimes it's just the negative part. People usually sometimes use social media just to complain, but they're not really like always a negative person, but they might appear to be negative online. So I would say that look, what first of all, you don't get a good idea of a person through their social media accounts. You get snippets. Okay. The second thing is that exposing one's personality can be flirtatious. Okay. I don't think that's the purpose of the internet. I don't think that's the purpose of social media. In social media, just like the internet should be a tool for research, for education, for communication, it should not be a tool for suhba. And I just to repeat that idea that it is a form of suhba, but it shouldn't be primarily the means of your suhba. So exposing your personality is part of suhba, is part of companionship. And I don't think that it's a good idea to expose your personality. Now, obviously, your personality does come out no matter how much you try to, be very businesslike. But emotional posts, etc. I mean, I don't think it's a good idea. I think people should use it as a reference source more than anything else. People should share knowledge and etc. And not try to develop social relationships, expose their personality, or try to learn about other people's personalities through social media. And one, I think maybe a helpful tip would be observe what the scholars, the righteous, pious scholars, and what I mean by scholars here is, as the Mujaddid al-Fithani says, the ulama rabbaniyun and Sufiya muhaqqiqun. That the Sufis of tahqiq, right, not the uninitiated or unknowledgeable and undereducated Sufis, but the educated, tahqiqi, investigative Sufis, and the pious and upright scholars. Observe how the scholars use their social media accounts, and preferably not the younger ones like myself, like the more experienced and the elderly ones. See how they use their accounts and try to imitate that, right? Because usually they are very controlled. I should say, if they're senior, they're always going to be very controlled. And see if you can tell anything about their personality through their social media. If you can, it's very little and it's very controlled. I hope that answered that question. Please, would you expand on your previous point about using social media to interact with a learned person? To what extent would this be acceptable? The question is, to what extent is this beneficial first? To what extent is it necessary first? So if you are trying to interact with a learned person or a shaykh by social media, the first question you should ask yourself is, can you interact with them in a better manner? Meaning, face-to-face. Okay. I think Rayyan Institute is one of the, mashallah, the institutions that speaks about this very well, that online learning is sort of a necessity, but not the ideal. So we prefer at Rayyan Institute that if you have if you're taking a class with, let's say, Maulana Tamim or Mufti Abdul Rahman, and you're living in the same city, and you can easily learn from them in person, then online interaction is not what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be interacting with them in person and taking advantage of the resources that are available to you. And I think people really need to exert themselves more in finding people face to face that they can interact with, so that the suhbah is of a more ideal nature. Now, if that's not possible, and this is obviously something that we at Rayyan very much recognize, that if that's not possible, then interaction online is a compulsion, is a necessity. To what extent it would be acceptable is the hudud of the Sharia. There shouldn't be complete privacy, right? So if you're interacting with the opposite gender, if the guide is a female and you're a male, or the guide is a male and you're a female, then the interaction should be not in such a way that there's absolute privacy. It should be something that others are accessing. So if you're a wife, for example, and you want to interact with a male teacher, it should go through ideally an account that is shared with the sheikh's wife, or your account is that you're interacting with the Shaykh with is not your personal account, but like your family account that everyone has access to, right? And only in cases of extreme need would you use privacy, like for example, if you're in a case of abuse or something like that, in which case you should obviously just to the extent that it's permissible use the internet to communicate with them. So I hope that answered the question. To what extent is it acceptable? Is you have to ask first when you're interacting with learned persons or shiur online. To what extent is it needed, and to what extent is it going to benefit you? How do you have no khalwa seeking advice from a sheikh, etc. over email? Email is one-to-one communication. So I think I maybe have answered that. That email is not necessarily one-to-one communication. Email is going to be sometimes like monitored, right? And even if you want it not to be, like if you're communicating as a female with a male sheikh and it's a very private issue that you don't want the sheikh's wife to necessarily be following, you have to let that be known so that the sheikh can actually make some sort of arrangement so that it's still not private. Sometimes it's just a matter of what, like in mental health field counseling, it's sometimes sufficient to keep a door open and to have people be able to access, like if you're going as a female to a male counselor, someone else doesn't necessarily need to hear exactly what it is that you're saying to the sheikh, but they need to know that you are not in complete privacy because the door is open, right? And there's no flirtatious communication taking place. So one of the ways that that's done today, from what I understand, from how I see people using the email to communicate with shuyukh, is that the email is not private. So the sheikh may have a secretary or may have a khadim or may have a family member who has access or is actually reading those emails and then sending it to the sheikh, right? And that's one way to make it not one-to-one communication. Do you happen to know the name of the app you mentioned earlier to monitor usage? I don't remember. I actually, unfortunately, cannot remember. But I think a simple search should reveal a number of options, inshallah. Does this apply even for a sheikh and female students? Yes, it does. Remember, sheikhs are human beings. If you're a female student, you don't want to also be tempting them, right? You are going to the sheikh for spiritual guidance, not for emotional support necessarily. You're going for the spiritual guidance. You don't want to, oftentimes I've seen this, that female students will become a means of the sheikh to enter into impermissible relationships. So the sheikh was otherwise okay. But because the female student, was trying to fill a void in their life, and they wanted to do it through the sheikh as well, they found that the sheikh would fill that void. So I don't know how, you can ask many shuyukh, how many times they've been challenged with interaction with female students because of, just unfortunately just the nature of the problems oftentimes that the person is dealing with. So khalwa with the sheikh online is still not permissible. Right? If your spouse has opposite gender friends and they communicate through social media sometimes, is that acceptable? I think I sort of already discussed that. The situation, the scenario, maybe it can change, but the rules are the same. The rules are the same. So any communication that is not within the boundaries of what is permissible, right, and maybe khalwa and flirtatious, is not permissible regardless of even the gender, right? Especially in our day and age, we need to emphasize that. Okay. Or a doctor who is on call for 36 hours or more at the hospital. There's a lot of interaction with the opposite gender. Given the amount of time spent there, it has been noticed that many times they're joking and freely conversing. How to avoid such situations? Avoid it, and this is important, I think, principle people need to recognize when it comes to illicit relationships. Most often, illicit relationships or love relationships are not really love relationships. People hook up, so to speak, because of proximity more than compatibility, right? So you see like a lot of interesting. You see a lot of people from very different ethnic backgrounds. Doctors from different ethnic backgrounds, like a Pakistani doctor, will get married to like a Korean nurse. Now, why does it happen? It's not because they're from the same ethnic background, same even language, or same, status, social status. It has to do with proximity. If you spend enough time around a person and you then open yourself up and become flirtatious and you become very free in your conversation, not to the point, and you open yourself up personality-wise and things like that, then obviously you are exposing yourself to that which is impermissible. So if you are on call, I mean, be nice to your coworkers and everything, but too much of that, sort of opening yourself up and kind of flirtatious type of conversation obviously has to be avoided. Be very much like a bit to the point. Stick to what you're there for. This is your job. You're there to do your job, right? And so you want to make sure that you are good in your akhlaq, you show the best character, but you also don't be flirtatious. People, I don't know, for one reason, they cannot think it possible for you to be nice and to be friendly and not flirtatious. There's a clear boundary between the two. There's a clear different marker between the two. If the rules of khalwa are the same online, if someone of the opposite gender asks you a question, would you have to ignore it instead of answering? The way that I do it is that if a female asks me a question, contacts me, I usually, if it's going to be more than one simple, like, someone asks me what time is salat in masjid or something like that, then, usually I just tell my wife and that's it. But if there's conversation, then what I do personally is I let the person know that if you want to engage in some sort of conversation, that it's not going to be private. Meaning that if there's someone, my wife or someone else will be there to maintain the permissibility of that scenario. Okay? And I think that's necessary and may not be ideal for many people, but it is what is necessary. And I've done this in person. There have been times where people came to me in extreme desperation and they wanted to have a counseling, even though I'm, as I mentioned, kind of a counselor by compulsion. I'm not a trained counselor, but I've sometimes had to deal with these situations, and I've told my wife to be there with me. And if she wasn't there with me, then I've had her on the phone and muted her and told the person that if you're going to be interacting with me, then you need to know that I cannot be, whether it's online or in person or on the phone, it cannot be in khalwa. So, and sometimes when I take phone calls from people I have to work with regularly, then I do it with my wife around. So it's regulated in that way. I know these are very personal, but I think they're beneficial. I hope that my speaking about the way that I do it is helpful. It may not be the only way of doing it, though. If your partner hides his or her social media account and doesn't share it with his or her partner, then how can we persuade to change this? Is it permissible in a marriage? Is it a common problem? How can this be handled according to Islam? Do they need help? Many spouses say that they need personal space. Is the space allowed in married life? This issue is creating problems in the married life. How would you handle it? What do you say according to Islam? That's a lot of questions. SubhanAllah. It's not healthy. You need to have personal space, but not when it comes to, interaction, or uncontrolled interaction. So I think that's not a good idea. How do you persuade the person to change this? That's a case-to-case sort of issue. Right? Everybody's case differs, and so how you deal with that, it probably depends upon your particular scenario and your particular spouse. So I don't think I could give you specific advice for your specific scenario that might be useful without more knowledge. I would recommend you to ask one of your teachers, inshallah ta'ala, about your particular situation and how it can be handled appropriately. These are things that oftentimes are resolved by premarital workshops or attending lectures in which these are dealt with together. It's very challenging to convince somebody else of what is right without them also being exposed to themselves. You can't preach to your husband or wife. Is the stance that you take on khalwa a norm? Do most scholars take the stance? I've never heard of it. I find it to be a very beneficial stance, though. So determining the norm is very hard for people here, I think, today. And that's one of the challenges, as I mentioned, that these are very new technologies, new phenomenon. And I think scholars are making mistakes just like everybody else and learning as they go along. So it's very hard to look at the specifics of social media and to say what is the norm of social media or email. What I've observed from my mashayikh and some of my mashayikh and my current spiritual teacher, I've learned a lot from him. He teaches females at madrasa lil-banat, a female madrasa. And there was oftentimes times when he would have to communicate with the female teachers or the female administrators of the school. And when he would get those phone calls, he would call me into, or any other student, into the room, and he would have a conversation with someone else there. So he would always was very particular that whenever he was interacting with females, غير mahram other than his wife, that he would have somebody else there to make sure there was no khalwa. So he would do this on the phone, and I'm sure he did this in person. And so I'm kind of striking an analogy here that the same rules should apply also through email and social media. So I don't know what the norm is. I can't judge what the norm is, but I can only speak from what I know and from what I've seen from my mashayikh and what I benefited from in terms of sahaba. Is it okay to tell one's shaykh that you miss them, considering he's 3 to 4 times older? It's a difficult question to answer. I think that the fact that they're much older is helpful, but not necessarily. The question is why are you telling them that, right? Is it simply an expression of an emotion, or is it because you have, you simply want to desire that, or you want to show that you miss their company and you feel like you're not benefiting as much from not being in their company, like the Sahaba would say to the Prophet ﷺ if they were far away, that, Ya Rasulullah, we fear that we'll not meet you again, right? And the reason for mentioning that is because they wanted to know how they could benefit from them from afar, or that they're struggling because they feel detached from those spiritual guides. If that's the purpose, like I say this to my mashayikh all the time, like I feel I miss you, meaning I don't say I missed you, but I feel the pain of being away from my guides and being away from the people that I've studied with. But my reason for asking or saying that is that I want to know what to do about it, right? How am I supposed to benefit being physically distant from them? That's, I think, that's fine. If you're saying it because, it's sort of an expression of my emotional attachment to you, I need you, I'm clinging on to you, just like a spouse may do that with their spouse, then I think, you might want to reconsider the way that you express that, right? If it's oftentimes just fandom, I love you so much, and I like this and that, and you're just trying to get their approval, but because you're showing them appreciation, sheikhs don't get affected by appreciation. A lot of people, oh sheikh, I love you so much, this and that. Then you don't listen to them, you don't do your homework, or you don't do the adhkar that they tell you. Then obviously the purpose behind it, the intention behind it will make it perhaps impermissible. So it depends. Okay, so remember, we have to be people of usul. We have to look at the principles, not the specifics. I know that a lot of questions are very specific. Keep in mind the principles. This is what learning is supposed to teach us, to be people of usul, of principles, to understand what's the basic philosophy of it. What's the philosophy? If you understand the rules of khalwa, then we should be able to apply them to new platforms, new social media applications, etc. Okay, I hope that is a good summary of that. Group email, in the situation of Islamic societies and universities, it's acceptable to have a group email to communicate matters. Group email is not khalwa. And so as long as a person is interacting in a healthy manner, not being flirtatious, not being joking. I know universities is very common for people to sort of, even in public, because we just don't have we don't have that haya anymore. But we are also oftentimes very personal in our, I think they call them ISOCs in the UK, or MSAs over here in the US. You can be very flirtatious sometimes, even in public, right? Even in a group email. So technically, a group emails would not be khalwa, inshallah. But at the same time, especially with the younger crowd, we should make sure also we are very much observant of decorum and not being flirtatious or too personal in our communications. Khalwa is what is khalwa? Khalwa is isolation, or to be alone with someone. So one male and one female being alone, right? If you're not mahram, is not permissible because it's khalwa and it invites shaitan. The third person would be shaitan. So if you have you have two males and one female, and you have one male or two females, then the khalwa may not be there. And sometimes actually, even if you have a group, there's still sort of a khalwa, right? If, for example, one male and two females, and the two females are equally being flirtatious for whatever reason, or the opposite, if there's two males being flirtatious with the same female. But technically, more than two people would break the khalwa, as I understand it, if my learning is sound, or my understanding is sound. So the first rule about interaction is that you must avoid khalwa, and the second thing is that even if there is no khalwa, you must not be creating a khalwa or doing things that are still impermissible, even in a group setting. So the minimum number you should include in that setting is 3. Right? We have a rule where I teach at Al Qasim that if there's one male teacher and one female student, and the male students don't show up, then the class is canceled. Right? That's the rule of khalwa when it comes to the classroom. Even online, I would say if it's just one male, one female, that would be. And if there's no one else who's observing that gathering, then that would be khalwa, virtual khalwa. So, Shaykh Hamoud, you can, inshallah, I don't know how long you want this to continue. I'm just going along with it, inshallah.
Sorry, apologize about that. Jazakumullah khair. I really appreciate your taking the time to answer these questions. MashaAllah, very, very beneficial. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier was that, we want to keep this on topic. Now, when it comes to gender interaction, then that becomes a larger issue beyond social media. So, MashaAllah, the questions are really nice. They're really good, very interesting, and very beneficial. But because now they're kind of going into this other realm, beyond social media. So I think the Shaykh has taken a lot of time, given us a lot of time. So we'll just end it here. Any other questions that you may have, any follow-up questions, then you can definitely email us, support@rayyaninstitute.com, and we'll try to get them answered, either forwarded to Maulana Bilal if there's something specific you want to learn from him, or, one of our other scholars can, inshallah, respond to you. So yeah, inshallah, that will be it for today. Before we end, I just want to share the next topic. Excuse me. The next topic that we have planned for next month's webinar is going to be confronting uncomfortable norms, racism in our communities, by Maulana Hamza Makbul from I believe somewhere near Chicago. Inshallah, January 10th, 11 a.m. Central. So definitely join us for this webinar as well, which will be next month, inshallah ta'ala. So with that, I'm going to just ask Maulana to just make a brief dua to conclude this webinar, inshallah.
اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم عليه. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وأدخلنا الجنة مع الأبرار يا عزيز يا غفار يا رب العالمين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. وصلي وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأزواجه وعلى من تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. جزاكم الله خيرا. سبحان الله وبحمده، سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك، نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت، نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم.